listening to the Futures Podcast live from Space 4, a haven for digital cooperation physically located just a stone's throw from Finsbury Park Station in London. On this show, we meet the scientists, technologists, artists, and philosophers working to imagine the sorts of developments that might dramatically alter what it means to be human. Some of their predictions will be preferable, others might seem impossible, but none of them are inevitable. My name is Luke Robert Mason, and I'm your host for this evening. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm just fed up of the artificial intelligence debates. Perhaps it's because I live it almost every single day, but much of the conversation has quickly devolved into infighting between a small subset of tech bros who live perpetually online. It feels like whatever benefit AI may have to society is obscured by the desperate desire to hype the latest application of a tool for solving problems that we didn't even know we had. It's why it's more important than ever to heed the warning that the technology we create reflects the society we live in, and this technology in turn then shapes society. In short, the decisions that we make today will have a profound impact on the future. Thankfully, there are those who are showing us that it's possible to take a step back and find new ways to interrogate innovative technologies. These include my guests today, Dr. Eleanor Drage and Dr. Kerry McInerney, Senior Research Fellows at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Their new book, The Good Robot, puts human values such as social justice and dignity back at the centre of the AI discussion. And they do this by reimagining technology through a feminist lens. So, to show us how to develop good technology that is inclusive, cooperative, and participatory, please put your hands together and welcome Eleanor and Kerry to the Futures Podcast stage. I absolutely love the book, The Good Robot, and it has a word in there, good. I mean, robot we'll get to in a second, but this word, good, and this idea of good technology, it almost presupposes that all other technologies are bad technologies. So what is good technology, and is it even possible?
When we started this podcast, we called it The Good Robot to be kind of a provocation. It's quite pithy, it's quite fun, but we were trying to push back on this idea that technology was either inherently terrible, it was going to be awful for us, that the Terminator was going to rise up and kill us all. But it was also trying to push back on another idea that was getting peddled by Silicon Valley, by tech investors and entrepreneurs, which was this idea that any kind of innovation is good for us, that innovation was the word and the moment, that it meant we were pushing humanity forward in some way. And so what we wanted to do by asking what is good technology was to firstly just take a step back and say, well, actually, not all innovation is good. And what does it mean if we're trying to recenter our technologies around this idea of goodness? What does goodness mean to us? Is it about making things faster or more efficient? Or is it about making society more just or more ecologically sustainable? But then we also, wanted to make sure that we weren't projecting our own idea of goodness like forcibly onto our guests, onto the people we were talking to, which is why we always follow up this question of what is good technology with, is it even possible? Because while I certainly actually do think there are good technologies, I think there are good uses of technology, and my life is completely shaped and transformed by it, I also think it's really important that we're not dictating for people how they should feel about technology per se. And so that's why we want to leave space for kind of our most ardent critics who think that actually the vast majority of the technologies we see being developed ultimately aren't good for us, even if that's not necessarily the view that we have.
Well, Eleanor, I want to break that down a little bit. So you have a little inkling of what makes good technology. Is that different from something like AI for good?
We see technologies that are released into the wild because they are good enough. For example, the HMRC, so the government's photo checker tool that was released without having had enough testing on the population at large. And that meant that it wasn't able to identify the faces of women of colour, and it was telling them that their mouths were open when they were in fact closed. And when I chatted some engineers at some Tech UK drinks thing, they were like, oh, I actually worked on that technology that the government outsourced to us. And the government said, oh, it's good enough when we pointed out these problems. So what we really want to critique this idea of something being good enough. We ended up with the title The Good Robot as a kind of provocation. It's pithy, it's fun, it's kind of kitsch, it's reminiscent of a different time. It's very utopian in the sense that it will never be and must not come to be. It's a funny little trope rather than something in itself that should be developed. We're not a robotics podcast.
Well, if you called it the killer robot, I'm sure you'd have double the readers and double the listeners, because it does seem like that with all of these discussions around AI, as I hinted at the introduction, we fall into this hype cycle. But why is it important for us to make the ways in which AI is being discussed almost banal? Why should that be the starting point from which we can critique these technologies?
Make AI boring again. We've heard that a little bit. I think there's a lot in life that is doing something good that you don't hear about because it's not sexy and it's not in the news, and that's a great shame. Kerry and I actually met on a 2-year project where we worked for a big tech company and we were interviewing engineers about what they thought about AI ethics. And I harbour a fondness for this company, mostly because I don't think Kerry and I were much used to them, but also because they do a lot of things that are quite good. They support 999 calls. There's a lot of red tape in the organisation. They really don't have a move fast and break things mantra. And that means that they can actually do things that are useful, that are good. And I hope that there will be more companies like that perhaps struggle with the idea that they're not creating something incredibly innovative, or they don't have this the sheen of being one of these glamorous companies that everyone wants to work for, but are actually doing something that's socially beneficial.
Yeah, and I think when we say that we oppose some of this mysticism around AI, it's not that we don't think there shouldn't be joy in technology. I was thinking to myself, what do I see as being a really good technology? And I came back to the rice cooker, which is a technology that is not changed for a long time and yet is the staple of so many families. Also seemingly invincible. My family has a rice cooker that belonged to my grandparents, was used every single Sunday to make rice, an industrial amount for my very, very large family. And it's still going strong. I don't know how. But these are the kinds of technologies that I never stopped to kind of look at this technology in wonderment. It was just a very ordinary integrated part of my life. And it wasn't till another writer talked about their rice cooker and its importance to their family and their identity that I stopped to look at my own rice cooker and think wow, how much of my life and how many of my happiest memories actually circulate around this very mundane object. So I think that's the kind of enchantment that I'm really interested in. I think the problem with some of the hype or the mysticism that we see around AI is that it is not only very overtly a branding strategy, it's something that companies are evoking and stoking because they want to sell product, but it also leads to this vast overestimation of what these tools can do. I think it's fine to re-enchant the rice cooker because ultimately it makes rice. That's what it does. It does it really well. Some people do try to make cakes and all sorts of things in rice cookers. I'm not sure about that. Maybe the enchantment goes too far then. But ultimately, I think we're celebrating what something does well, what it was designed to do. That to me is not the case when it comes to the magic we see around AI. Instead, we see this silver bullet approach, this idea that, this tool has a magic to it because it can do whatever we want it to, or we can apply some kind of AI function to a process that actually doesn't need any kind of AI overlay. That's just going to muddy the waters and make things worse. So to me, I think the problem is not saying that actually we need to make all technology, or particularly AI tools, strip them down and take out any sense of magic to them, but rather asking, what does that enchantment do?
And just on that, so we ask people a lot, what is good technology to them? Because what we're not trying to get people to do is say, oh, here's a perfect technology, although there is the rice cooker. And actually the whisk is my favorite. But because we're saying, okay, your blood glucose monitor keeps you alive, but when does it not work? What happens when the cap falls off? Or like for one of my students, just the night before his exam, it fell off while he was sleeping, and then he had to do the exam with blurred vision, and then it's not a good technology anymore. Equally, we have students who turn off their fire alarms because it doesn't support like Indian cooking, for example. So it's really important to stop and think, okay, it's good for some people in some contexts, designed by certain kinds of people with certain kinds of assumptions, but it's also made of plastic or made of this or made of... So we try and get people to think of the materials and of the contexts. Also, because I think, you know, when occasionally I guest lecture in gender studies and everyone is so depressed anyway. And so I think I often stop the class halfway through and say, you know, I feel like we have a moral obligation as teachers to kind of just take a pause for people and say, okay, what kind of world do you want to live in? Picture me something in the future, something that doesn't necessarily exist yet. A tattoo that helps you find your way home. Anything could be made out of a material that doesn't exist yet. But what do you want? Because that lack of agency that I think a lot of students feel comes from not being asked, but having to constantly go to the streets to ask for things themselves.
And what they want is Basmati AI, which is a steamless rice cooker, which is Wi-Fi enabled, and you talk to with Amazon Alexa. That sounds like what good technology at its core is. But genuinely, though, I'm interested to know, what is it they're saying when you ask that question? What are some of those responses you're getting when you go out into the world and see how others are interpreting this idea of good tech?
I think one of the most wonderful things, particularly about working with students, but also seeing the way that this conversation has moved forward, is I think how much braver and more creative they are when it comes to thinking about what they want from the world and their hopes for the world. Or, you know, certainly we're seeing in Cambridge at the moment an encampment for Palestine, and we're seeing that in universities across the world. And I'm just really incredibly moved and grateful that this is something that so many of our students have taken upon themselves, that they don't want the world to continue in the violent status quo that it's currently existing in. And that goes as well for their visions for technology. And I think as easy as it is to be hypercritical about the world as it stands, and I was talking to you before this, Luke, and was talking about my work previously being on prisons and immigration detention centers, which are inherently bad systems and so require a huge amount of negative critique. You know, I'm also really, really inspired by this kind of new generation of ethical engineers and ethical computer scientists who have seen all the negative effects that social media platforms and new technologies have had on their generation. And so they feel this real desire to try and address and fix those problems. I think it's particularly damning because they're also not responsible for these problems, but they're the ones ultimately who are the most determined to change these things.
Well, you hint in the book that there are some principles that we can draw upon to move towards good or better technology, and those are the sorts of technologies that are seen through the lens of not just feminism, but feminisms.
It doesn't exactly roll off the tongue.
Yeah. But could you explain what you mean by feminism plural?
Yes. Well, Kerry and I are not like Channel 4 journalists. So when people come onto the podcast, we ask them nice questions. And if they don't like what they say, we just edit it out for them. So we're not going to win any Pulitzer Prizes. But we've thought it was really important to be inclusive in the way that we understand feminisms. And by that, we mean, you know, if there's like a Buddhist philosopher that we think is doing something that we can classify as feminist, we're like, we think your work is feminist, come on the podcast. And I'm still surprised when people say yes. I think it's a really nice thing that people are willing to be rebranded in that way, but also find the connections between feminism and the work that they do. Of course, there is this big debate now around, you know, what constitutes feminism. Are trans exclusionary feminists feminists? Can we call them feminists at all? And I've been doing a little bit of research into the way that the philosophers that I love are trying to think about this problem. Because, of course, you were like, yes, we're so inclusive with feminism, but, you know, there's lots of people we don't invite on the podcast. You know, this is not Joe Rogan. Like, we have a nice conversation with people that we really like and admire. And I wonder whether it is the nature of all things to go bad. And they still have to be classified as feminisms, even if, for example, you have some corporate feminism where you have to do the corporate feminism thing and you have to classify it as feminism in order to be in the room and have those conversations. So I'm interested in which words do certain kinds of work, and I like the plurality of things for now. Maybe we will change that going forwards when our book editor, whoever it is, finds it really clunky and awful. But for now, it does a certain kind of work.
Yeah, I love the idea of you two just wandering around the world, just anointing people as feminists as you go. But something you said there, which was so important, which is the piece around language. You know, the language through which we talk about this stuff defines the lens under which we look at it, and then defines our usage to some degree. So do we need new ways to discuss some of these topics? It always feels like a cop-out to go, we need new language. But is there raw material in it from another field that we can use and apply to innovation or AI that we're not doing right now because of this hype cycle?
I think this question of language is really important and really fascinating. And it's easy for people to say, well, it's just semantics, or you're academics. Of course, you like to talk about language and talk about narratives and stories. But I think one of the reasons why we started this podcast and why we continue to do this work in science communication is based on this profound belief that the stories we tell about technology are really powerful not only for shaping what we imagine technology to be, but also very tangibly shaping what kinds of projects get funded, what kinds of technologies get made. And there's this very interesting genealogy, what some of my colleagues call the Californian feedback loop, between, say, the kinds of technologies that are imagined in Hollywood and then the kinds of technologies that are then funded and created in Silicon Valley. And I know, Luke, that you have a very strong interest in AI and narratives and public perceptions of robots. So I'm sure this is something that's very familiar to you. But for anyone who's listening in the room or online, I would really encourage you to take a deeper look at this, at how these stories shape the kinds of technologies that get made. And so for me, when I'm trying to think about the language I use to describe AI, it's a delicate balance between, again, trying to demystify AI in some way, trying to be as accurate as possible, again, as a science communicator and as a researcher, but also trying to think about what kinds of stories, as a writer and a storyteller, will resonate with people and allow them to see AI a little bit differently. So for me, a lot of that comes from science fiction. I'm particularly interested in science fiction written by Chinese diasporic writers and what those stories might be able to tell us about the world. But it's also something increasingly I'm trying to do in my own creative practice in life, which is think about what kinds of stories can we draw out from our own experiences that might help people relate to their technologies a bit more differently.
And also, how joyful that people care about language now. Because when I was doing my English Lit and French degree, everyone was like, what was the point of that? And I was banging on about how important the different kinds of language we use to describe things was. I think I'd, done one class on, signifier, signified, sociaux, and was really captured by it. And it felt so useless at the time. And then in my PhD, I looked at which was on science fiction written by women who were French speaking, Spanish speaking, Italian speaking, and were writing in English. And I have this whole incredibly boring section on the different words they use to talk about queer theory. And I loved how, you could find exactly the right word in English that was, the proper word for something. And then you translate it and it wouldn't work at all. And I love that, the breakage between one language and another. And I think translation is politically so interesting. And I'm really interested in these kind of global solidarity movements and feminism from Veronica Gargo's work in Argentina. And that whole thing of how do you translate ideas between languages in a way that actually I think keeps language on its toes. It keeps it mobile and interesting and allows it to develop. And I know that Judith Butler has done so much work on this in relation to gender, this idea of the gender ideology that even the Pope uses the word gender because it signifies something. It's not Italian. It's not, it's this other import from the West that has no religion, this kind of godless West with this thing called gender.
The thing that united both of you was a love and an interest in stories and science fiction. And in a funny sort of way, The Good Robot book, it feels like a collection of short stories. They may not be science fictional, they might be near future fictions, but they do show that if we just move from language of, say, domination to language of symbiosis, we can change the narrative around some of these tools.
Absolutely. And that's one of the most lovely descriptions I've heard of the book, a book of short stories. So I'm going to remember that. And, I think that what really unites maybe both of our ideas around this is just this idea that language is very, very powerful, that it's not simply a way of getting information from A to B, but it plays an active role in creating our world. And language itself can just be this really powerful form of resistance. So I was really lucky a few weeks ago to hear Peter Lucas-Jones, who is the CEO of Te Huku Media, which is in New Zealand, is a Māori AI-powered language app and part of a much broader project around Indigenous data sovereignty. And something that he said in his presentation was simply, to speak our language, or speak the Māori language, te reo, is to resist in the face of brutal colonization, in the face of the deliberate eradication of te reo Māori as attempted by the New Zealand colonial government and thereafter. And I found that really moving because certainly as someone who grew up multiracial, multicultural, but only really speaking English, I think I, and probably a lot of other people, feel a lot of shame when it comes to trying to speak the languages that we maybe never attained fluency in. And so there was something I found quite moving about just saying, well, actually, just trying to speak at all, like that's a way of reclaiming that heritage. That's a way of speaking back to power. And so I think that language is not only powerful and world shaping, it's also very emotive and emotional for a lot of us. And I think probably all of us here in very, very different contexts feel language very deeply. And I think sometimes that's something we lose when we talk about language in these very formulaic ways.
Just to go back to something you were saying on symbiosis, in the book we have this essay by Anne Catherine Hales, who, if you don't know their work, the kind of grandmother of thinking about literature and computation, wrote this fantastic book, My Mother Was a Computer, and then recently Unthought, which, if you're looking for a more interesting way to think about consciousness and cognition than the masculinized, I am a conscious man and I exist alone from, separated out from everything else around me, the kind of contemporary Vitruvian man way of thinking about consciousness, then definitely read their work. Their essay is about symbiosis, which is what you're referring to. When we think about symbiosis, we often think that it's a fluffy kind of let's hug a tree thing, like, oh, we're all connected and, symbiosis, lovely. But symbiosis can be cancerous. It can be devastating. It's very dangerous. If you think about the plover birds that sit in the mouths of the crocodiles, they have a symbiotic relationship. But God, that's dangerous. And so this symbiosis, I think, to use Kerry's word used a lot, can be queasy, it is intimate, it can be very difficult, which is also what solidarity is, that close, intimate relationship with people. That can also be a dangerous endeavor. So there's nothing sweet about this feminism or these feminisms. They reckon with the complicity of your use of a technology for something like activism that is owned by Meta, or just to preface that way of thinking about symbiosis.
Yeah, there's nothing sweet about feminism. Got it? That's the. I'm always reminded of Sadie Plant, who I revived this mid-90s cyberculture conference at the University of Warwick called Virtual Futures. Sadie Plant, who was one of the original cyber feminists, she used to run this panel called Replicants, the Future of Cyber Feminism. And it was to make exactly that point. There's nothing cute about cyber feminism. And then Pat Cadigan, the science fiction author, she goes, what do these men think we're going to do by bringing cyber feminism into the internet? Do you think we're going to access the internet and bring pop pants? Like, how does she think this is going to work? So there was that kind of this energy, this vibe, this as you were saying, nothing sweet about it.
There was when we went to the University of Washington on our book tour, one of the engineering students asked, very genuinely, is feminism in science about making robots pink? I was like, that would be really cool. My hair is pink for those listening, but also no.
Also no. Well, let's play some more word games, because you talk about good design in the book, and you preface that by saying the way to do good design is turn design from a noun to a verb. I often talk about human being and how we should change that into human doing when we think about futures. So what did you mean by that, and how does that linguistic turn allow us to use design as a feminist tool?
I mean, I'll let Eleanor speak maybe to the linguistic aspect of it, as I have already foregrounded. Words, ironically, is not actually my strong point. But, by saying we want design to be a verb, not a noun, what we were pointing to is two things, really. Like, the first is this idea of creation is often this iterative process. It's something that's always going on, and something that gets really overlooked in tech design, particularly AI, when there is such a focus on the new and the interesting and the shiny, is the constant practice of care that is required to maintain products in order to keep them accurate, to keep them working for everyone, to improve them when they're not working, and then finally maybe to retire them if they're not needed anymore, they're not working as they should be. And so, by saying designer is a verb, we're saying it's a process that must be ongoing, and you need to have the resources, the time, the capacity to care for these things. The other reason why I think it's helpful to reframe design from a noun to a verb is to think about the way that almost personalizes or grounds this idea of design, that design is something that I think we're all doing in different ways in our lives. I think we're always adapting products to fit ourselves better, whether that's changing just simply where the apps are on your home screen, or maybe more radical designs like altering a dress. And I say this, with humility, because I'm not a design theorist, I'm not a professional designer. I think the work designers do is phenomenal, and I want to respect that expertise, while also saying, but there's a lot of us who engage in these everyday design practices, and we learn a lot from that. I think it's particularly important when we look at, say, disabled designers, or particularly disabled people who engage in all sorts of regularly design practices and choices to reconfigure their environments that haven't been made for them. And in doing so, they're really leading as technological innovators themselves. And someone we've had on the podcast, a designer called Cynthia Bennett, who's a computer scientist, I believe now at Apple, writes a lot about this and explores this history of disabled designers that very rarely gets foregrounded when we think about the history of design. And so part of this transformation from design as noun, kind of thing, like this is a separate field that not many of us are maybe engaged in, to design as a continuous shared process, is something I've found helpful for thinking about feminist approaches in this area.
And wasn't the safety peeler, which is one of my favorite good technologies, although it's not fully good because it's not fully safe if you're as idiotic in the kitchen as me at peeling. But that was invented by the wife of the person who became known for having invented it. Betty, I know she was called. Can't remember what he's called, ironically.
I think there's also such a wonderful history of love in a lot of products and design. And my personal example of this is Bird's custard powder, something I never had till I moved to the UK. I believe was created by Bird because his wife was allergic to eggs. And I think that's the kind of story we also see in a lot of these products, which it's not only about the individual saying, I want the world to be better for me, but people saying, I want the world to be better for someone I love. And how wonderful to think about design, not just about trying to make the most profitable, efficient product, but saying like, this is about creating a world where people can live in however small a way a little bit better.
Yeah, and that's lovely, but there's something disguised in that love when we put the name of the designer as the person who, takes the credit for it. I actually have at home these dolls I made during my PhD that, the Matryoshka dolls, the ones that they get bigger or get smaller. I painted them with the faces of the women science fiction authors who used male pseudonyms to write their book, because in Italy up until 1960s, really publishers wouldn't publish anything that women wrote, except in like the Jali or the Pacific publications. And I think it's probably the same with the history's invention. That's why it's so wonderful to have the historians of AI. I love them. I love historians generally. I can't remember any dates at all, so I could never be one, but that's very important. So the doing, the becoming, the process, we think of utopia as blueprint, as the thing that needs to be made, but Queer theory, which is my background, has a lot to say about the utopia beyond the horizon. If you know Jose Munoz, amazing thinker, talks about the kind of ever-deferred horizons. It's something we work towards. It's the process of working towards that matters, a process that should be filled with love. And the best kind of utopian scholarship focuses not on utopia as blueprint, as the Thomas More, here's my map, this is the economic structure, this is where you go, or, Brave New World, where you know where everybody sits in the pecking order. Those kinds of utopias veer very quickly towards fascism. And what we want is to keep the process as the utopia. So you cannot have a good technology where the process of creating it excludes people, marginalizes people, shouting in teams, the firing of people at Google because of, X, Y, Z. That is impossible. The process must be good. And I remember my dad and I are quite like Machiavellian, we'll just do whatever it takes to get to the, if we have to run to get to the restaurant, we'd rather be there than just, do something different with our evening. And I had one of my ex-boyfriends was like, it doesn't matter if we don't get to the ferry, we'll take another ferry. We can have a walk around the thing, And I just thought, really? Can your evening be good if it's not the evening that was planned? And I really think I've learned a lot about, the whole trust the process thing from America is just not me. I do not trust the process. But
we know why he's your ex.
It's so annoying.
Well, let's talk about that process because at the core of it, it's about who gets to imagine those futures, who gets to make those decisions as to whether you catch the ferry or take the meander, and those choices, they have affect, they change how we create, I guess, these utopias or these environments that we're in. So let's go one step further and think about users of technology, because the environment in which we swim, the technology in which we use in our everyday, often that's communicated as the bad technology. It has perverse incentives behind it. So what can everyday users of consumer tech do to make sure that their behavior with what you might understand as bad tech, it can be a little bit better?
This is a really interesting question. And I think there's been some really interesting critical work as well on this idea of the user. And we actually have one participant in this essay collection who talks about how with her own products, she deliberately tries to avoid the term user and uses participants or communities instead. And I found that really interesting because user is definitely a word that I, prior to that, still used quite uncritically. But I think when it comes to people's everyday tech use, what it means to use technology more ethically, I think, can be very complicated, particularly when we're looking at spaces beyond, say, deliberately misusing a technology in a really negative way. Because I think, as Eleanor's gestured to, so many of us are complicit in different kinds of power relations. Even the rice cooker, my technological love, that itself is a technology that is still made and probably made by people who are very underpaid. And despite the fact that it's very long living compared to a lot of other technologies, it will still probably ultimately become e-waste. Hopefully not the one that is still in my parents' house, but all the other ones. And so, I think for all of us, when I'm thinking about what it means to use technology better, some of it is just that process of reckoning with, okay, what does it actually mean to use technologies and not see them as individualized, disconnected products, but seeing them as part of our broader social world. And this is one of the major goals of science and technology studies, so broadly the field that the three of us are in, which is thinking about the social and political role that technologies play and how they're part of the world itself. So that's one kind of really big thing I would suggest. And then the second one I would suggest as well is thinking about what it means for our technologies to respond to a real need. Because I think there's an ugly duality at play here, I think, whereas on the one hand, you have big tech companies really selling us a lot of stuff we don't need. I know you were joking about the Amazon Alexa rice cooker, but when people say, I really get excited that my coffee machine can speak to my kettle, I just think, well, what are they saying? What kind of conversation can a kettle and a coffee machine be having? This is not an exciting function to me. What problem does that solve? So on the one hand, we're getting sold to me a lot of stuff that maybe, and for a lot of us, isn't necessary. And then on the other hand, we're increasingly bringing on more and more technology into our lives that maybe makes our life slightly more convenient, but maybe it isn't necessarily responding to a need, or we're taking on technologies in the short term that we think respond to a real need because we're scared or because we're lonely or because we're anxious, but maybe in the long term actually aren't good for us in our societies. So I think about this a lot when it comes to surveillance technology, where there can be forms of everyday surveillance that might be really useful for us in a moment, say people who are really, really anxious for good reason during COVID, so they were getting Ring doorbells. But then what does it actually do to our society as a whole when suddenly there's this big surveillance web of integrated home technology available, and then that data is often then sold to police authorities. So that was a very long way of saying, I think this economy of need and want is very complicated when it comes to tech. And I'm not pretending to be innocent of that. I have all sorts of garbage on my phone. If you went on, I have the weirdest apps. I also find joy in these technologies, but it's something that I'm increasingly trying to challenge myself to do as well.
This is why not all innovation is good. And so, we often see this trade-off between, there's a trade-off between innovation and regulation. It's about finding the balance. That's the corporate thing. But because not all innovation is good, obviously so, what we try and say is that, that's been totally overstated. And in fact, regulation supports good innovation. So it's not a question of balancing anything. I think that's one of the most annoying things that I hear. And once you hear it for the first time, you can't unhear it. And that's quite an easy win, I think, just putting that forward. And I'm working on a regulation project. I was going to say an innovation project. We don't innovate. We just moan from the corner. No, I'm working on a regulation project that will hopefully be the world's first free tool that helps companies meet the EU AI Act's obligations, defined through feminist and anti-racist ideas. So we are joining forces between technical approaches to resolving harms in AI and socio-technical approaches. So it's kind of an interesting game to see what are the limits of, a fairness mechanism in solving some issue, and when does it actually have to be a question of corporate culture or, these other sort of larger systemic issues. And I just want to say one thing on the question of language, the user participant thing, and back to what you were saying about semantics. This is a classic example of where people think, oh my God, this is like feminist nitpicking of we can't call them a user anymore. We have to call them a participant. And I remember when I was doing my undergrad, and in the French class, we had a really brilliant French lectrice that we obviously didn't appreciate at all. And she was saying how, we had to use the female form of words to reclaim the female form of words because, actrice is one that you do hear a lot, but autrice, you don't hear so much. A female author, an authoress, which sounds very Margaret Atwood, like the murderess in Alias Grace. And then meanwhile, there was American actors, women actors in the States who were demanding to be called actors instead of actresses. And I thought, how interesting that these two things are happening at the same time. So there is that kind of flexibility around language. And in gender studies, this happens a lot. We're constantly asked to reclaim new words or use words in a different way. And then, people get their backs up. Oh, I thought it was that. Or my mom being like, but I just learned the new word. How can I learn another word? And people get really upset about it. But a flexibility around language is so important because, as feminism knows too well, language is power. And so to be able to keep things mobile, but also keep people on board and people willing and invite them to participate in the new language and not be afraid and understand what the point of it is, that's the game.
There's so much in what you two have just said, and I think it's important to drill down into some of that. In the first instance, the idea that these technologies will talk to each other, that they will have human qualities. It always reminds me of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or Red Dwarf that has Talkie the Toaster, whose raison d'etre is to toast, therefore I am. But by humanizing these technologies, we then hide the inhuman things that we're doing. So that point you made there is extremely important. And then what both of you do so well with this book and with the podcast is to, as you said there, Eleanor, allow us to hear things that we cannot then unhear. And you have multiple examples of that. You gave a couple there, but this idea of alignment, alignment to AI alignment. It's like, well, to whose values, or fairness, who defines fairness or user. Yes, we want to remove that word from the lexicon of talking about individuals who use technology, but then again, it comes with the onus under which we use the word user. So user makes me think of a drug user, and therefore it's appropriate. Just give me more Facebook, man. Just give me more Facebook. I just need my Facebook. Yeah. So these things, these nuances to how language allows us to navigate these environments, I think is so vitally important. So I want to thank you both for that. But equally, if those things not fail, but once we're aware of those things, then what do we do? So the question I have to ask you is, how do we integrate activism into desiring or moving towards good technology?
Oh, I love that question. I think something that comes out of this book and comes out of our work more broadly is that activism can look very different for different people. And I want to say that with caution because, as Eleanor alluded to earlier, talking about turfism or trans-exclusionary radical feminism, I do think it's important to have red lines, which is why, again, we don't support on our podcast anyway, any kinds of trans-exclusionary feminisms. But at the same time, I also think when it comes to, say, questions of do you collude with big tech? Do you work for big tech? Do you refuse to work with or for big tech? Do you believe in the neo-Luddist movement that's arising and saying we need to resist all sorts of different kinds of tech development because of the negative effects they're having on our politics and our society? Do you believe in the fact that maybe there's some kinds of technology that we can exploit and use for good, but we need to be very careful with it? I think these kinds of ethical debates and the contestations here make our activism stronger. And so, the point, I guess, here that I'm trying to make is that it can be very easy for us to fall into a politics of purity where we say, okay, well, what we need is for all of us to subscribe to one particular doctrine and go about our activism in the same way. Whereas I wonder if a more helpful conversation to have is what are our complicities? What are our red lines? And what kinds of actions or activism can exist in that in-between space where we can pursue the better world that we want while recognizing that we're never going to ourselves maybe be free of the imperfect societies that we currently live in. So for me, activism looks like teaching. It looks like often doing the work that maybe is not very sexy or exciting. It might be going through archival documents, creating huge resources, trying to track, say, histories of biometric surveillance in the British Empire. And that's me using the skills that I have as a researcher to resist in the way I know how. That might not be the right kind of resistance or activism for someone else, but it's the resistance I feel best positioned to do. And then I guess as simply as possible, I also think activism for me just looks like speaking up, which is really, really non-exciting in many ways. It's not particularly radical. But I think I sometimes have in the past really undermined the extent to which just simply being able to name a situation, to call attention to power, can actually be really important and validating. And I think something that brought this home for me, I'm sorry, this is, quite a dark example, is I remember in the Atlanta shootings, when a number of particularly East Asian women were killed by a gunman, I remember going onto Twitter that morning after that had happened and seeing just how many people had kind of posted in support of ESEA or East and Southeast Asian people, of AAPI people, Asian American people, and Pacific Islanders. And I remember seeing that and being really moved by it, partly because I think before that, I, to be honest, had seen a lot of that kind of activism maybe as quite performative or thought, well, what difference does it really make if I send out a tweet? But I remember going on and then seeing how many people who actually did not have, I would say, a responsibility necessarily to that community that I belonged to, so particularly Black feminist activists, particularly other kinds of racial justice activists, had taken that time and that moment to share in that grief with us. And that just made me feel very, very humbled. And so I think ever since then, I've had maybe a slightly different relationship to this idea of what simply speaking up as activism can and should look like, and how actually our digital spaces can be quite powerful in facilitating that.
People were so nervous about being labeled an activist for so long. I always found it quite an intimidating thing, because, I'm like, well, do I do as much as the other activists? No, surely not. I saw last week at Cambridge an advertisement for a seminar for people doing biological sciences, and it was, is there a place for activism in the biological sciences around the environment? And I thought, oh my God, they're like 20 steps back compared to, the rest of the humanities. And, to us, it's really obvious. Well, yes, but maybe they do activism. Maybe they do have these conversations at home. Maybe they do support groups like Extinction Rebellion. Maybe it's just a question of like empowering people to have these ideas at work, either when they're teaching or doing their research. Of course, there's a place for activism, and probably they're already doing it. So is the problem the word itself, the fact that it's labeled activism? Is that what kind of freaks people out? Yeah, I'm just really interested to see, and as Kerry said, I think you're totally right. People who do community work in different ways, can that be called activism? And actually, does it matter?
Well, in that case, I guess my final question is, if you could redesign the world based on the principles in both your book and your podcast, what would that look like for you both individually?
With a rice cooker queen.
It's just one large rice cooker all the way down. Just a little question to end with. So for me, I often talk about the way that I approach feminism, about being able to live more freely and fairly and expansively against the kind of confines of racism and sexism and homophobia and all these other kinds of ways that confine us. And so for me, I think that prison abolitionists have had some of the most creative and important ways of revisioning our societies and asking what would it mean for us to live in places where we all actually meaningfully feel safe. At the same time, though, I think this idea of trying to redesign the world itself is so complicated because, I'm thinking of the different kinds of contexts that I grew up in. So much of what it means to design, what it means to live in community with one another is to do so in the irreparable wake of colonial violence, of different kinds of violent processes. And in those situations, different communities' view of a perfect future is so conflictual and contested. And so I think ultimately what we'll end up with is something that is deeply imperfect in many ways, but at the same time, I hope allows us to kind of coexist more freely because of that. And so I don't know if I can prescribe what I would want the world to look like apart from, again, no prisons, a place where we can live freely, better rice that's really directed at Cambridge's colleges. The rice is very dry. Aside from that, I think this comes back to what Eleanor was saying around utopia as process, I think, or this idea of, I don't know if I could have a blueprint for what I think a good society should look like, but I hope that the stories that we've brought together in this book start the kinds of conversations that bring us there.
This is a difficult one because to me, utopia is an affective space. It's about how you feel. When you said before that once you see things, you can't unsee them, that's very depressing. To me, depression is pattern recognition. That's how I experience it. It's seeing things that you realize they come together in a particular way and they affect everything that you see. I think there's a place for pessimism, although obviously not depression, in the kind of work that we do. And there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic. But pessimism is not the same as fatalism, which is what we see a lot in the tech industry. This idea that AI will come and we will all die. That's fatalism, and that freezes you so that you can do nothing. Like when I start thinking about my backhand in tennis, and then my elbows go up, and then I can't hit anything, and I shout at myself. That is when I'm most angry, is on the tennis court, because I'm not very good. The act of freezing is paralyzing. So to me, the utopia is the place where we know that we are here on this earth to work together. We can't choose who we cohabit the earth with. To know that democracy is other people, and to find a pleasure in it. To find some way to enjoy being with each other in all our differences and all our disagreements. and to know that we have purpose in our anger or in our frustration, so that we don't feel so alone and so miserable.
Well, I think we all got a fascinating insight into your psyches this evening. So there we have it. Good technology looks like a deeply imperfect rice cooker, and I'll allow the audience to work out the meaning of that metaphor. I want to thank you for joining us for the Futures Podcast Live. I want to say a massive thank you to Space4 for hosting us this evening, and to Natasha Natarajan for her organisation. Eleanor and Kerry's new book, The Good Robot: Why Technology Needs Feminism, is available now. You can also listen to their podcast, The Good Robot, available wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like what you've heard, then you can download the Futures Podcast on your favourite podcasting app, or follow us on social media at Futures Podcast. More episodes, live events, transcripts and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Please put your hands together and join me in thanking our incredible guests this evening.